That ditch, she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescending authority that only a 50-something HOA president in a powder blue tracksuit could muster, is a community necessity, Mr. Corrigan. Your personal property line is irrelevant when the greater good is at stake. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on the clipboard she held like a scepter, a smug little smile playing on her lips as I stared at the 10-foot wide, 4-foot deep trench gouged diagonally across my backyard. A backhoe sat idling a few feet away, its metal claw caked with the rich soil and shredded roots of what, just this morning, had been my lawn. My perfectly graded, newly sodded lawn that I had spent thousands of dollars and countless hours perfecting. And in the middle of that muddy scar, splintered and torn from the earth, lay the remains of a young silver maple tree. My memorial tree, the one I planted for Specialist Danny Rivas, my gunner, who didn't make it home from Kandahar. I could feel a cold, familiar calm settle over me, the kind that precedes a storm, the one that kept me alive in places where irrelevant property lines were the last thing on anyone's mind. But this was my home. This was supposed to be the quiet place, the place where the storms were finally over. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the estates at Eagle's Landing, had just declared war, and she had no idea who she was fighting. If you think that's insane, and believe me, it gets a whole lot crazier, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare story, I want to hear it. Because what Karen and her board did next wasn't just a violation of my property. It was a cascade of ignorance, arrogance, and criminality that they were about to pay for, dollar by painful dollar. You see, they picked a fight with a quiet homeowner, but they were about to find themselves in a legal battle with a man whose entire career was built on enforcing the very laws they were so brazenly breaking. My wife, Sarah, and our 7-year-old daughter, Lily, had been my anchor for the last decade. After 15 years in the Army JAG Corps, prosecuting everything from petty theft to war crimes, I was done. Done with the deployments, done with the constant moving, done with the sand and the institutional grayness of it all. All I wanted was green grass, a tire swing for Lily, and the peace that comes with putting down roots. We found it, or so I thought, in this meticulously planned community just outside the city. The houses were nice, the schools were good, and the glossy brochure promised a harmonious living experience. We paid a premium for a corner lot, one that backed onto a quiet stretch of county-owned woodland. It was the biggest yard in the neighborhood, a perfect canvas for the life I had envisioned. The first thing I did after we closed was plant the maple. It was just a sapling, barely taller than Lily, but it was important. It was a living thing, a promise of growth and endurance. A quiet nod to a friend who would never get to see his own daughter grow up. I graded the yard myself, using a transit and laser level I borrowed from an old Army engineering buddy, ensuring the drainage flowed perfectly away from the house and toward the natural swale at the far edge of the property. I laid the sod piece by piece, a green quilt that symbolized the end of a nomadic life. For 3 months, it was paradise. Then the summer rains came. Not just normal rains, but the kind of biblical deluges that seem to be more and more common these days. I noticed some of the houses further up the hill, the ones closer to Karen's oversized McMansion, had some minor pooling in their yards. Nothing serious, just the result of developers who cram as many houses as possible onto a plot of land with little regard for natural topography. My yard, thanks to my careful grading, was fine. The water sheeted off exactly as planned. I didn't think much of it until the first HOA newsletter arrived, a passive-aggressive document printed on garish yellow paper. It spoke of a community-wide drainage issue and a proactive solution being implemented by the board. There was no vote, no request for comment, just a declaration. I should have seen it coming. I should have known that in a place like this, proactive solution was code for Karen had an idea. The day it happened, I was at my new job, settling into a role that was supposed to be a quiet transition into civilian life. I was an assistant prosecutor for the county, assigned to the Environmental Protection Division. It was mostly paperwork, reviewing permits, handling minor pollution complaints, and ensuring developers followed the rules. It was a world away from military justice, and that was the point. When I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, the rhythmic thud of the backhoe was the first sign that something was wrong. It was a sound of violation, of destruction. I saw the churned up earth of my neighbor's side yard, and then I saw the trench. It was a brutal, ugly gash that started near the street, cut across the corner of my neighbor's property, and then sliced diagonally across the entire 100-foot length of my backyard before terminating in a muddy pit near the woods. And there she was, Karen, standing beside it like a proud general reviewing her troops. Her arms were crossed over a chest strained by the tight-fitting tracksuit, a look of profound satisfaction on her face. That's when she delivered her line about the greater good. My first instinct, the one honed by years of confrontation, was to unleash a torrent of fury that would peel the cheap gold plating off her hoop earrings. But I choked it down. The JAG officer in me took over. You don't win by yelling, you win by documentation, by procedure, by letting your enemy's own arrogance become the rope they use to hang themselves. Karen, I said, my voice dangerously level, who authorized this? She scoffed. The Architectural Control Committee on behalf of the board, of course. We have a drainage easement. It's all perfectly legal. She waved the clipboard vaguely. It's for the community. Show me the easement, I said. Show me the survey document that gives you the right to excavate my property. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It's in the covenants. You should have read them before you bought the house. She turned to the backhoe operator, a weary-looking man in a greasy baseball cap. Keep going. We need this finished by tomorrow. The operator glanced at me, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but a sharp look from Karen had him lowering the bucket back into the trench. You will stop this work immediately, I said, my voice dropping an octave. You are trespassing and you are destroying private property. Every scoop of that bucket is adding to the damages you and the HOA will be paying for. Karen let out a short, barking laugh. Threats? Really, Mr. Corrigan? You're new here. You'll learn that we don't respond to threats. We are the authority here. She pointed a finger at the splintered trunk of the maple tree. And you should have gotten approval for that tree anyway. It wasn't on the pre-approved landscape list. That was it. The final piece of insulation on my self-control burned away. She had not only desecrated a memorial to my friend, but she was now trying to find me for it. I pulled out my phone. Fine, I said, my thumb already on the camera icon. Let's document this. I'm going to get a picture of you next to the illegal trench on my property with that backhoe in the background. It will make a lovely Exhibit A. I walked slowly along the edge of the trench, my phone held high, recording everything. The depth of the cut, the destroyed sod, the mangled roots of my other shrubs, the shattered maple. I panned over to the backhoe, getting the company name on the side, and then lingered on Karen's face, her smugness rapidly curdling into anger. You stop that! You can't film me! She screeched, her voice cracking. Oh, I can, I replied, my voice cold as ice. You're on my property overseeing an act of criminal destruction. There's no expectation of privacy here. Now, for the last time, tell your man to get that machine off my land before I call the sheriff. Karen's face, a mask of indignant rage, was the last thing I saw before she spun on her heel and stomped toward her gleaming white SUV parked at the curb. She didn't tell the operator to stop, but her retreat was a small victory, a crack in her armor of self-importance. The operator, however, seemed to have more sense. He saw the look in my eye, the phone still recording in my hand, and decided his paycheck wasn't worth being a co-defendant in a lawsuit. He killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the chirping of birds and the quiet hum of the suburban afternoon, a peace that had been so violently shattered moments before. He climbed down from the cab, avoiding my gaze. Look, man, he mumbled, wiping his hands on his jeans. I just go where they tell me. She showed me a map she drew herself on a napkin. A map drawn on a napkin. The absurdity of it was almost comical, if the result wasn't a gaping wound in my yard and my life. I nodded, the cold calm returning. It's not your fault, I said, and I meant it. He was a pawn. But you need to get this machine off my property now. He nodded gratefully, and within minutes, the backhoe was trundling back down the street, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. Sarah came out the back door then, her face pale. Lily was peeking out from behind her, her small face a mixture of confusion and fear. Jack? What happened? What is all this? Sarah whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the trench. I walked over and put an arm around her, pulling her close. It's our HOA president, I said, my voice tight. She decided we needed a new water feature. I looked down at Lily. Hey, sweet pea, it's okay. Just a big mess. We'll fix it. But Lily's eyes were fixed on the broken maple sapling. Daddy, she said, her voice trembling, Danny's tree is broken. A fresh wave of anger, hot and sharp, pierced through my calculated calm. This wasn't just about sod and property lines anymore. This was about family, about memory, about the one sacred piece of ground I had claimed for a fallen brother. I spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously documenting every inch of the damage. I took hundreds of photos from every conceivable angle. I used a tape measure to record the length, width, and depth of the trench at multiple points. I took close-ups of the severed roots of my mature oak trees that stood near the property line, their stability now potentially compromised. I bagged a sample of the splintered maple tree. This was no longer a homeowner dispute, it was a case file. That evening, after putting a very unsettled Lily to bed, Sarah and I sat at the dining room table, the documents for our house spread out before us. The closing papers, the title insurance, the survey plot map, and a thick, spiral-bound copy of the estates at Eagle's Landing, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Are you sure she can't do this? Sarah asked, her finger tracing the boundary line on the survey. It just seems so insane. There has to be some rule she's twisting. I flipped through the CC and Rs, my eyes scanning the dense legalese. I'd read it cover to cover before we bought, a habit from my JAG days. You read the fine print, always. I'm sure, I said, tapping a paragraph in the section on easements. Look, it defines the utility easements clearly. 10 feet along the front of the property for public utilities and a 5-foot easement along the rear property line, specifically for drainage and utilities, and it's contiguous with the county-owned land. This trench, I pointed out the window into the deepening twilight, is, at its closest point, more than 30 feet from the rear property line. It cuts right through the heart of the lot. There is no easement here, not a single inch of one. I found the section on architectural control and landscaping. It was filled with draconian rules about the color you could paint your door and the type of mailbox you could have. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing, granting the board the right to perform major excavation on a homeowner's property without their express written consent. In fact, it stated the opposite. Any alteration to the topography of a lot required a detailed plan submitted by the homeowner and approved by the committee. Karen hadn't just broken her own rules, she'd inverted them, weaponizing a document of control against the very people it was supposed to govern. So what do we do? Sarah asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. Do we have to sue them? I looked at the pile of evidence I was already assembling in my mind. The photos, the operator's admission, the clear language of the covenants. Yes, I said, but we're not just going to sue, we're going to dismantle them. She wanted to use the HOA's power to hurt us. I'm going to use the actual law to show her what real power looks like. The first call I made the next morning was to a friend from my Army days, Tom Casey. He'd been a brilliant litigator in the JAG Corps and now ran a successful civil litigation practice downtown. I explained the situation, my voice flat and emotionless as I laid out the facts. She did what? Tom's voice crackled over the phone. She dug a trench across your yard based on a napkin map? Jack, this is a gift. This isn't a lawsuit. It's a slam dunk. We'll get an injunction so fast her head will spin. I want more than an injunction, Tom, I said. I want full restoration, damages, and I want her held personally liable. I want to pierce the corporate veil of the HOA. Her actions were so far outside the scope of her authority, she wasn't acting as a board president. She was acting as a vandal. Tom was silent for a moment. That's aggressive, but I like it. To do that, we need to prove gross negligence or willful misconduct. The napkin map is a good start. There's more, I said. She's claiming it's for a community drainage issue. I'm a prosecutor for the county's environmental division. Tom, I'm going to look at this from another angle. I have a feeling she didn't just break property law. I'm willing to bet she broke environmental law too. A low whistle came through the phone. "Oh, Karen," Tom said with a chuckle, "you have no idea the hornet's nest you just kicked." The second call was to a licensed surveyor. I explained the situation and asked for an emergency survey to be conducted, specifically to stake out my property lines and officially document the location of the trench relative to those lines. He promised to be there the next day. The war had begun, and I was mobilizing my forces. Karen thought her clipboard and her title gave her power. I had the state statutes, the county codes, and the full weight of the legal system on my side. She had drawn a line in the sand, or rather, a trench in my sod, and I was about to make her regret it for the rest of her life. The surveyor arrived the next morning, a wiry man named Gus, with sun-crinkled eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He set up his transit, and for the next 2 hours, he and his assistant moved methodically around my property, planting little pink flags and taking measurements. I watched from the kitchen window, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. The process was a balm to my frayed nerves. It was tangible, precise, and governed by the unyielding laws of mathematics and land rights. It was the antithesis of Karen's napkin map anarchy. Sure enough, Karen's white SUV soon cruised to a stop in front of my house. She got out, her arms already crossed, her face a thundercloud. She marched onto my lawn, or what was left of it, and confronted Gus. "What is the meaning of this? You are on private property," she declared, puffing out her chest. Gus, to his credit, didn't even flinch. He just peered through his instrument, made a note on his pad, and then turned to her with a look of mild amusement. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl, "I'm a licensed state surveyor hired by the property owner to conduct a survey of his land, and you are currently standing on it. So if anyone's trespassing, it's you." Karen's jaw dropped. She was so used to her authority being absolute within the confines of Eagle's Landing that the idea of an outsider not immediately bowing to her will seem to short-circuit her brain. "The HOA is responsible for this land," she sputtered. "We have easements." "Well, ma'am," Gus said, pointing to the series of pink flags that now clearly delineated the boundaries of my lot. "According to the official plat map filed with the county recorder's office, this entire trench, from end to end, is located on Lot 72, which belongs to Mr. Corrigan. The drainage easement is 28 feet that way." He gestured toward the far back of my yard. "Well, you missed it by a mile, or to be precise, by about 35 feet at the closest point." He handed her a copy of his preliminary sketch. "You can give this to your lawyer. I'm sure he'll find it illuminating." He then turned his back on her and went back to his work. Defeated and speechless for perhaps the first time in her adult life, Karen snatched the paper, shot me a look of pure venom through my kitchen window, and stormed back to her vehicle. The report Gus sent me later that day was a thing of beauty. It was a clear, legally defensible document with maps, measurements, and a sworn statement confirming that the HOA's excavation was located entirely on my private property, far outside of any platted easement. I immediately forwarded it to Tom, who cackled with glee. "This is perfect," he said. "We've got them dead to rights on trespass, destruction of property. Jack, we can ask for treble damages based on this. It's willful. The surveyor's report proves it." "Good," I said. "Draft the letter. I want it to be a cannonball through their front door, cease and desist all further work, a demand for a full restoration plan within 10 days, and a preliminary statement of damages, including the cost of the sod, the tree, the survey, and the potential harm to my mature oaks. And Tom," I added, "make sure you send it via certified mail to every single board member's home address, not just the HOA's P.O. box. I want them to feel this personally." While Tom drafted the legal salvo, I shifted my focus to the environmental angle. Karen's arrogant statement about the greater good and the community drainage issue echoed in my head. What was this drainage issue? And what was their trench supposed to accomplish? I pulled up the developer's original grading and drainage plans for the entire subdivision, which were on file with my department. I spent hours poring over the topographical charts and engineering specs. The plan was clear. Each lot was designed to handle its own water runoff, directing it toward the street or to natural swales and designated drainage easements at the rear of the properties. The system was, on paper, perfectly adequate. The problem, as I suspected, wasn't the plan, It was the execution and the subsequent alterations. I took a walk around the neighborhood that evening, this time not as a resident, but as an investigator. I saw the evidence everywhere. People had built unapproved patios, retaining walls and raised flower beds that acted like small dams, disrupting the natural flow of water. The worst offender was, unsurprisingly, Karen. Her property at the highest point on our street was a fortress of hardscaping. A massive concrete patio, a three-tiered fountain, and a series of brick-and-mortar planters had effectively turned her entire backyard into a non-porous surface. All the rainwater that fell on her lot was channeled through a single, discreet-looking pipe that emptied directly onto the lawn of her downhill neighbor. From there, the water cascaded from yard to yard, overwhelming the original design and causing the pooling I had seen. The community-wide drainage issue was in large part a Karen-created drainage issue. Her solution was not for the community. It was to collect all the water she was dumping on her neighbors and funnel it away so she wouldn't have to listen to them complain anymore. And her chosen path for this new artificial river was my backyard. Her trench was a crude and illegal attempt to bypass her own responsibility, collecting the runoff from several properties, and I now realize with a dawning sense of horror, directing it toward the county-owned woods behind my house. Those weren't just any woods. I pulled up another set of maps on my county computer, the ones from the Environmental Division. My heart started beating faster. The woodland behind my property was designated as a protected wetland buffer zone. It was a sensitive area, home to a variety of migratory birds and a crucial part of the local watershed's filtration system. Discharging a concentrated flow of untreated stormwater into a protected wetland buffer was not just a bad idea. It was a serious violation of both county ordinances and the Federal Clean Water Act. The potential fines weren't in the thousands of dollars. They were in the tens of thousands per day, per violation. And Karen, in her infinite wisdom, was about to line the trench with concrete, making it a permanent, efficient conduit for delivering polluted runoff directly into a protected ecosystem. The lawn fertilizers, the pesticides, the oil and gasoline residue from driveways, all of it would be collected and mainlined into this fragile environment. My personal property dispute had just escalated into a significant environmental crime. I saved the maps, my mind racing. This was the leverage I needed. This went far beyond the HOA and its petty tyrants. This was my professional jurisdiction. Karen thought she was fighting a homeowner. She had no idea she was about to go up against the county. The next day, two things happened. First, the certified letters from Tom were delivered. My phone started ringing with blocked numbers, which I ignored. The other board members, who had likely just rubber-stamped whatever Karen put in front of them, were having their morning coffee interrupted by the threat of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. The second thing was far more audacious. A cement truck rumbled down our street and parked in front of my house. A crew of workers began unloading forms and rebar, preparing to pour a concrete liner into the illegal trench. I walked out to meet the foreman, my jaw tight. "You can't be serious," I said. "This is private property, and the owner has not authorized this work. In fact, my lawyer has sent a cease and desist order to the HOA. The foreman, a big man with a sunburnt neck, just shrugged. "Lady from the HOA paid us in full yesterday. Said it was an emergency job. We're just here to pour the concrete." Before I could argue further, Karen's SUV screeched to a halt beside the cement truck. She practically jumped out, her face flushed with a triumphant fury. She brandished a piece of paper in her hand, a letter from the HOA's lawyer. "This is our official response, Mr. Corrigan," she shouted so the whole street could hear. "Our lawyer says your claim is baseless. The board has broad authority to act in the best interest of the community. We are proceeding." She was doubling down. Even after receiving a formal legal threat, even after being presented with a professional survey, her arrogance was so profound that she couldn't conceive of being wrong. She was actually going to pour the concrete, locking in the damage, escalating the violation from temporary to permanent. It was the single dumbest strategic move she could have possibly made, and it was the best thing that could have happened for my case. "Go ahead, Karen," I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. I held up my phone and started recording again. "Pour the concrete. Please, document your willful and intentional escalation of this crime. Make my case for me." My smile seemed to unnerve her more than my anger ever had. She hesitated, her bravado faltering. But she had an audience of workers and nosy neighbors peeking through their blinds. She couldn't back down now. "Do it!" she shrieked at the foreman. "Start pouring!" As the first wave of wet, gray concrete sloshed into the trench on my property, I knew I had her. She wasn't just trespassing anymore. She was constructing an unpermitted, permanent structure that was about to cause an environmental disaster. And I had it all on video. The soupy gray concrete filled the trench. A permanent scar of arrogance poured directly onto my land. The workers, directed by Karen's triumphant glares, smoothed the surface, creating a perfect, unnatural channel. It was an astonishing act of defiance. She had received a legal demand to stop, backed by a professional survey, and her response was to make the damage irreversible and 100 times more expensive to fix. It was a move born of pure ego, a declaration that in her kingdom, the law was whatever she said it was. I didn't interfere further. I just stood there, my phone steadily recording every detail: the concrete truck's license plate, the faces of the workers, and Karen, preening like a dictator at a military parade. This footage was no longer just for a civil suit. It was evidence for a criminal complaint. Once they were finished, the crew packed up and left, leaving behind a brutalist concrete flume that looked grotesquely out of place in the green suburban landscape. Karen gave me one last smirk before climbing into her SUV and driving away, confident that she had won, that she had put the new guy in his place. That evening, I sat down at my computer, but this time, I wasn't looking at property deeds. I was logged into the county prosecutor's official network. I was no longer Jack Corrigan, angry homeowner. I was Assistant County Prosecutor John Corrigan, Environmental Division. My hands moved with a familiar, practiced efficiency, the same way they had when I was building a case against an insurgent leader for using banned munitions. I opened a new file, case number E-23-0874, unpermitted alteration of a watercourse and illegal discharge into a protected wetland buffer zone. The defendant, the Estates at Eagles Landing Homeowners Association, Incorporated, and its board members, listed by name. I began to write the narrative, my tone shifting from personal grievance to the cold, objective language of a legal filing. I detailed the unauthorized excavation, citing the survey from Gus. I described the construction of a permanent, impervious concrete channel, citing my own video evidence. Then I laid out the environmental violations, referencing the county and state codes chapter and verse. I cited the developer's original, approved drainage plan, and demonstrated how the new channel fundamentally and illegally altered it. The core of the complaint was the discharge point. The new ditch terminated just feet from the boundary of the Elm Creek Nature Preserve, the official name for the protected wetland behind my house. I attached the county's own environmental impact studies for that preserve, highlighting its designation as a critical habitat and a key component of the regional watershed. I explained in excruciating detail how concentrating the stormwater runoff from nearly a dozen homes laden with fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and petrochemicals from driveways and streets and discharging it at a single point would have a devastating effect. It would cause erosion, introduce toxic pollutants, and promote algal blooms that would choke out native plant life and starve the water of oxygen, killing fish and amphibians. It was, in legal terms, a point source of pollution, and it was completely unlicensed. I didn't just make accusations. I provided the math. I calculated the approximate square footage of the impervious surfaces, roofs, driveways, Karen's absurd patio, that would now drain into this channel. I used standard rainfall models to estimate the volume and velocity of the water that would be jetting out of the end of that concrete ditch during a typical summer thunderstorm. The numbers were staggering. It was like pointing a fire hose of poison at a delicate terrarium. The final section of my report was the recommendation for enforcement. I didn't ask for a slap on the wrist. I recommended the maximum penalties allowed by law: a stop work order, which was technically moot but legally necessary, a notice of violation carrying fines of up to $25,000 per day, retroactive to the day the excavation began, a demand for a full third-party environmental impact study to be paid for by the HOA, and most importantly, a legally binding remediation order, which would require the HOA, at its own expense, to not only remove the concrete channel and restore my property to its original condition, but also to fund a long-term environmental monitoring program for the wetland and pay for any ecological restoration it might require. The total cost to the HOA would be astronomical, easily cresting into six figures, not even counting the civil suit Tom was preparing. I worked late into the night, compiling every piece of evidence into a single, unassailable digital file. The survey, the photos, the video, the CC&Rs, the county maps, the engineering schematics, and my own sworn affidavit. Before I submitted it, I added one more thing. I did a quick search of county records and found that the estates at Eagles Landing had been cited twice before for minor environmental infractions, improper silt fencing during a common area landscaping project, and a complaint about the community pool's backwash draining too close to a storm sewer. Both times they had been issued a small fine and a warning. Karen had signed off on the compliance forms for both. This established a pattern of negligence. This wasn't their first offense. At 8 a.m. the next morning, I walked into the office of my boss, David Chen, the lead prosecutor for the Environmental Division. David was a sharp 50-something man who had seen it all and had zero patience for developers or corporations who thought they could get away with cutting corners. David, I said, closing the door behind me, I need to disclose a conflict of interest and also hand you the easiest, most slam-dunk case you'll see all year. I laid out the story, sticking to the facts, downplaying my personal anger. I showed him the key photos on my tablet, the trench, the broken tree, the concrete truck, Karen's smug face. Then I showed him the map of the wetland buffer. David listened intently, his expression growing more and more grim. When I was finished, he was silent for a full minute, staring at the picture of the concrete ditch. "Let me get this straight," he said finally. "Your HOA president, with no permits, no survey, and no legal authority, excavated a trench across your private property and installed a permanent concrete channel to dump the neighborhood's stormwater into a protected wetland?" "That's the short version, yes," I replied. "And you have her on video, overseeing the concrete pour after she had been served with a cease and desist from your civil attorney?" "Correct." David leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Good Lord. The sheer arrogance is breathtaking. It's like she's trying to win a stupid contest." He looked at me. "Conflict of interest disclosed. But Jack, there's no conflict here. You're a victim of a crime that happens to fall directly under our jurisdiction. You didn't create this situation. You documented it. And the evidence is pristine." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "We have to act on this, and act hard. If we let a homeowners association get away with something this blatant, it sets a precedent. Every developer from here to the state line will think they can bypass the permitting process." He turned back to me. "File it. I'll sign off on it myself. Issue the notice of violation and the remediation order today. Send it via a process server to the HOA's registered agent and to every board member's home. I want them to be served papers at dinner, in front of their families. Let's see how broad their authority feels then." The official notice went out that afternoon. It was a thick packet of documents, bound with a cover sheet from the county prosecutor's office, stamped in red with the words, "Official Notice of Violation and Order to Remediate." It was a declaration of war, not from a disgruntled homeowner, but from the government. The gears of justice were now grinding, and Karen and the HOA were about to be pulled into them. While the county's legal machinery was spooling up, I knew I couldn't rely on that alone. A government action could get bogged down in bureaucracy, and while the fines would be painful, I wanted to ensure the pressure was personal and relentless. It was time to build a coalition. My first stop was my next-door neighbor, George. He was a retiree in his late 60s, whose side yard had also been clipped by the corner of the trench. I'd seen him watching the whole fiasco from his window, but he hadn't come out. I found him in his garage, meticulously polishing a vintage motorcycle. George, I said, leaning against the doorframe. Got a minute? He sighed and put down his polishing cloth. Jack, I saw what they did. It's a damn shame. I'm sorry. They dug on your property too, I pointed out. I know, he said, avoiding my eyes. But it's Karen. She's been running this place for 10 years. You cross her, and your life becomes hell. Last year, my brother parked his RV on the street in front of my house for 2 hours while he was visiting. 2 hours. She had it towed. Cost me $500 to get it back. She'll fine you if your trash cans are out a minute past 9 a.m. She measures the height of your grass with a ruler. It's easier to just keep your head down. This was the fear she cultivated, the source of her power. It wasn't consent, it was exhaustion. She's not just measuring grass anymore, George, I said quietly. She's committing felonies. I'm not just suing her. I've filed a formal complaint with the county's environmental division, the one I work for. George's eyes widened. You're kidding. I'm not, I said. They are facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and a legal order to remove that ditch and restore the land. Those fines? The cost of the restoration? That comes out of the HOA budget, our budget. Our dues are going to skyrocket to pay for her ego trip. I let that sink in. The fear of Karen was strong, but the fear of a massive special assessment was stronger. And my civil suit, I continued, is naming her and every board member personally. We're arguing that their actions were so negligent that they aren't protected by the HOA's insurance. They could lose their houses. George finally looked me in the eye, a flicker of something new, anger igniting in them. Personally? Good. It's about time someone stood up to that woman. My next visit was to Mrs. Gable, a sweet woman in her 70s who lived 2 doors down. Her pride and joy was her garden, a stunning collection of prize-winning roses that lined her back fence. Her house was downhill from the new ditch's path. I found her staring at her rose bushes, her face a picture of despair. The ground around them was a swampy mess. The previous night's rain, instead of sheeting off naturally, had been collected by Karen's concrete flume, and because the termination point was crudely dug, a significant portion of the water had backed up and overflowed, flooding the lower part of her yard. They're ruined, she said, her voice trembling. The roots are completely waterlogged. They'll all get black spot and die. This is because of the new ditch, isn't it? I asked gently. She nodded, wiping her eyes. It never flooded here before. Never. The water came out of that concrete thing like a fire hose. I took photos of the damage to her garden, my anger simmering. Karen's solution was already claiming more victims. Mrs. Gable, I said, I'm building a case against the HOA. Would you be willing to provide a statement about the damage to your property? She looked from her ruined roses to me, her sadness hardening into resolve. That woman has been bullying this neighborhood for years. Yes, I'll write whatever you need. I started going door to door, a man on a mission. The stories poured out. A family who was fined $50 a day because their daughter's swing set was made of cedar instead of the pre-approved plastic. A man, another veteran, who was ordered to remove a small flagpole from his porch. A young couple who had to repaint their entire house because they'd chosen a shade of beige that was one tick off on the official HOA color palette. With each story, the picture of Karen's reign of terror became clearer. It was a pattern of abuse, of power wielded for its own sake. Many were still too scared to join me openly, but I found my core group of allies. George, the quiet retiree, Mrs. Gable, the gentle gardener now seeking justice for her roses, and Mark, the veteran who had been forced to take down his flag. Mark, a former Marine sergeant, was particularly incensed. She told me the flag was visually disruptive, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. I told her this was America. She told me this was Eagle's Landing, and her rules superseded the U.S. flag code. I wanted to... Well, I didn't. But I've been waiting for this day. We agreed to call an informal meeting at my house that weekend. I wanted to show them the case I was building, to let them know this wasn't just a hopeless fight. The day before our meeting, the process server made his rounds. I was in my front yard, ironically trying to rake some of the debris left by the construction crew, when I saw the van pull up to Karen's house. A man in a polo shirt got out, walked to her door, and rang the bell. Karen answered, a scowl already on her face. The man said a few words and handed her the thick legal packet. I saw her take it, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion, and then to dawning horror as she saw the official seal of the county prosecutor's office. She looked up and her eyes met mine across the street. The smugness was gone. In its place was the first flicker of genuine fear I had seen in her. She slammed the door shut. 10 minutes later, I heard a commotion from down the street. It was Harold, the HOA treasurer, a meek accountant who always seemed terrified in Karen's presence. The process server had just left his house. Harold was standing in his driveway holding the packet, his face ashen. His wife was trying to talk to him, but he looked like he'd seen a ghost. One by one, the pillars of Karen's little kingdom were being served notice that their reign was under threat, and not by an angry neighbor, but by the full force of the law. The stage was being set for a confrontation, and this time, it wouldn't be on my lawn. It would be in a public forum where all her subjects could see that the Queen was not as powerful as she thought. The unofficial neighborhood meeting at my house was standing room only. I had expected maybe a dozen people, more than 30 crammed into my living room. Word had spread like wildfire. The sight of a process server going from house to house, delivering thick, ominous-looking legal documents to the board members, had been the talk of the neighborhood. Fear of Karen was being rapidly replaced by morbid curiosity and a growing sense of outrage. I stood before them, with Tom Casey, my lawyer, by my side. I had laid out all the evidence on my dining room table. The survey map with its damning pink flags, glossy photos of the trench and the concrete pour, copies of the CC and Rs with the relevant sections highlighted, and the big one, a large printed map showing our neighborhood, the illegal ditch, and the protected wetland it was now aimed at. Thank you all for coming, I began. I know many of you are worried about what's been happening, and you have a right to be. For 10 years, Karen and her board have operated with no oversight and no accountability. They've used our money to enforce petty rules and intimidate residents, but this time, they've gone too far. I walked them through the story from the first appearance of the backhoe to the pouring of the concrete. I explained the law in simple terms, showing them how the HOA had no right to be on my property. Then Tom took over. From a civil standpoint, he said, his voice calm and authoritative, the HOA is liable for trespass, destruction of property, and diminution of value. We're seeking not only the full cost of restoration, but also punitive damages. And as I've advised Mr. Corrigan, we are naming the board members as individuals. Their actions constitute gross negligence, which means the HOA's insurance policy may refuse to cover them. They could be on the hook personally. A murmur went through the crowd. The idea of Karen having to pay out of her own pocket was a tantalizing one. Then it was my turn again. I pointed to the environmental map. But this, I said, my voice hardening, is where it goes from a civil matter to a state and federal crime. I explained the concept of a protected wetland, the function of a watershed, and the laws governing them. The county prosecutor's office, my office, has issued an official notice of violation. The fines for what they've done can be as high as $25,000 per day. As of this morning, the potential fines are already over $200,000. A collective gasp filled the room. Who pays for that? Someone shouted from the back. You do, I said bluntly. The HOA pays it, which means every single one of us will pay for it, either through a massive special assessment or through our dues being tripled for the next decade. All to pay for a problem that Karen herself created with her own illegal landscaping, and a solution that was really just her trying to avoid taking responsibility. The anger in the room was palpable now. It was a living thing, growing and feeding on years of suppressed resentment. Mark the Marine stood up. So what's the plan, Jack? How do we fight back? The plan is simple, I said. Karen has called an emergency HOA meeting for Tuesday night. She's going to try to spin this, to portray herself as the victim, to say I'm the one causing trouble for the community. She's going to ask for your support. We are all going to be there, but we're not going to be silent. I looked around the room at the faces of my neighbors, no longer afraid, but angry and determined. We are going to demand her immediate resignation and the resignation of the entire board. We are going to vote in an interim board and we are going to demand a full, independent financial audit of the HOA's books for the last 10 years. George, who had been so timid just days before, spoke up, his voice clear and strong. An audit is a great idea. My brother-in-law is a forensic accountant. He said the landscaping budget for this place is 3 times what it should be for a neighborhood our size. He always suspected someone was skimming. The plot thickened. The ditch was the presenting symptom. The disease was a decade of unchecked power and potential corruption. The meeting became a strategy session. We organized a list of speakers. We prepared a formal petition demanding the board's resignation and a financial audit, and people lined up to sign it. We designated Mark to run for interim president. For the first time, the residents of Eagles Landing weren't isolated subjects of a petty tyrant. They were a unified front. The day of the HOA meeting, the atmosphere in the community was electric. Karen had plastered the neighborhood with flyers, printed on the same garish yellow paper as her newsletters. They accused a disgruntled new resident of launching a frivolous and costly attack on our community and urged everyone to come to the meeting to show solidarity against this threat to our property values. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to control the narrative. She had no idea the narrative had already left her behind. The meeting was held in the small, sterile clubhouse by the community pool. It was designed to hold maybe 50 people. By the time I arrived with Sarah, Mark, and George, there were already over 100 people there, spilling out the doors and onto the pool deck. Every single person from my living room meeting was there, and they had brought friends. Karen and the 3 other board members, including the ashen-faced treasurer, Harold, sat at a folding table at the front of the room. They looked beleaguered, cornered. Karen, however, had put on her game face. She was dressed in a severe-looking navy pantsuit, her armor for the battle she thought she could still win. She banged a gavel on the table. "Order! Let's begin the emergency meeting," she bellowed, her voice straining to project confidence. "As you all know, the board has taken proactive steps to solve a long-standing drainage problem in our community. This was a necessary project for the good of everyone. Unfortunately, one resident has decided to take legal action that threatens our entire community with baseless lawsuits and government fines." She glared directly at me. "This action is selfish and will cost every one of you money." Before she could continue her tirade, Mark stood up. He was a big man, and his Marine bearing gave him an immediate presence. "Karen, we're not here to listen to your lies," he said, his voice booming through the room. "We're here to demand your resignation." A wave of shock, followed by a roar of approval, swept through the crowded clubhouse. Karen's jaw went slack, her carefully prepared speech rendered useless before she could even get to her second point. The other board members flinched as if they'd been struck. "That is out of order," Karen shrieked, banging her gavel furiously against the flimsy table. "You are not recognized." "I don't need your recognition," Mark shot back, his voice cutting through the noise. "I'm a homeowner, and I'm speaking, and so are a lot of other people." He held up the petition we had all signed, which now had nearly 100 signatures. "This is a petition signed by a majority of the homeowners in this association, demanding the immediate resignation of you and this entire board for gross negligence, malfeasance, and putting this community at extreme financial and legal risk." Karen stared at the petition as if it were a snake. Her power had always been predicated on the idea that she spoke for the community. Now the community was speaking for itself, and its voice was unified against her. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "You can't. The bylaws—" George, the quiet retiree, stood up next. His voice wasn't as loud as Mark's, but it was filled with a newfound steel. "I've read the bylaws, Karen. Section 9.4. It allows for the removal of a board member with a majority vote of the members at any meeting, regular or special. We have the majority right here in this room. We are calling for that vote, right now." Harold, the treasurer, looked like he was about to be physically ill. He kept glancing from the angry crowd to Karen, his face a mess of panic. "Karen, maybe we should listen," he began, his voice a weak whisper. "You be quiet, Harold," she snapped, turning on him. "This is a coup, orchestrated by him." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "He's the one who brought the government in. He's the enemy." I stood up then, and a hush fell over the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I'm not the enemy, Karen, I said, my voice calm and steady. The law is not the enemy. Your own actions are the enemy. You trespassed on my property. You destroyed my lawn. You broke a memorial to a fallen soldier. When my lawyer told you to stop, you escalated. You poured concrete. You committed a crime. That's not me being disgruntled. That's a fact. I gestured to the crowd. You flooded Mrs. Gable's garden. You created the very problem you claimed to be solving by turning your own property into a concrete slab, violating the very drainage plans you're supposed to uphold. You have abused your power, intimidated your neighbors, and now you have exposed every single person in this room to hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and legal fees. The threat to our property values isn't me, Karen. It's you. Every point landed like a body blow. The crowd murmured in agreement, nodding, their own grievances finding voice in my words. Karen looked around, her eyes wide with desperation, searching for an ally. She found none. The faces staring back at her were cold, angry, and united. Her little kingdom had crumbled. "We're calling for the vote," Mark said again, his voice ringing with finality. "All those in favor of the immediate removal of Karen Peters as president of the estates at Eagles Landing Homeowners Association, say aye." A deafening "aye" erupted from the crowd, a single powerful sound that shook the flimsy clubhouse walls. "All opposed," Mark called out. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Not a single voice rose to defend her. Even the other two board members, Harold and a woman named Brenda, stayed silent, staring down at the table. Karen's face went from red to a blotchy, pale white. She had been publicly and unanimously deposed. It was over. "The motion carries," Mark declared. "Karen Peters is no longer president." He then proceeded to do the same for each board member. Brenda and the fourth member were voted out with the same thunderous aye and chilling silence. When it came to Harold, George spoke up. "Harold, you have a chance to do the right thing. Resign now and agree to cooperate fully with an independent financial audit." Harold looked at Karen's stunned face, then at the determined crowd. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his hands trembling. I resign," he stammered, "and I'll cooperate. I'll give you everything." Karen shot him a look of pure hatred, a wounded animal turning on its own pack. "Traitor," she hissed. "Now," Mark said, taking control of the meeting as if he were born to it, "we need to elect an interim board to manage this crisis. I nominate Jack Corrigan." I immediately shook my head. "I appreciate that, Mark, but I can't accept. As the plaintiff in the civil suit and the primary witness in the county's case, it would be a major conflict of interest. I can advise, but I can't lead. I nominate you." The crowd roared its approval. Mark was elected interim president by acclamation. George and Mrs. Gable were elected to serve alongside him. Their first official act was to pass a motion. "The interim board's first motion," Mark announced, "is to formally recognize the validity of the county's notice of violation. We will cooperate fully with the prosecutor's office. We will immediately seek professional bids for the removal of the illegal structure on Mr. Corrigan's property and for the full restoration of his land to its original or better condition, with all costs to be borne by the HOA. And we will commission a full independent forensic audit of this association's finances for the past 10 years. Every motion passed unanimously. Karen sat there motionless as her entire world was dismantled piece by piece. The authority she had wielded like a weapon was gone. The secrets she may have been hiding were about to be unearthed. As the meeting adjourned and people began to file out, patting me on the back, shaking Mark's hand, a sense of community I had never felt before filled the air. It was no longer a place governed by fear. It was a neighborhood again. I walked past the table where Karen was still sitting, a solitary, defeated figure. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a venomous, impotent rage. "You'll regret this," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You've ruined this community." "No, Karen," I said, stopping for a moment. "You did. I'm just the one who's cleaning up your mess." I turned and walked out into the cool night air, joining my wife and my new allies. The war was won. Now the reconstruction could begin. The days following the meeting were a whirlwind of activity. The newly formed interim board, led by Mark, acted with the decisiveness and transparency that had been absent for a decade. Their first order of business was to hire a new law firm, one that specialized in HOA law and conflict resolution, not just aggressive defense. On their new lawyer's advice, they formally responded to my attorney, Tom Casey, and to the county prosecutor's office. The response was a complete capitulation. They acknowledged the HOA's liability, accepted all terms of the cease and desist, and pledged full cooperation. Mark called me personally. "Jack, the board has authorized me to get this fixed and fast. We're getting bids for the demolition and restoration right now. We want to do this right. What do you need?" "I need it gone," I said simply. "I want the concrete gone, the ground regraded to the original specifications, and new high-quality sod put down. And I want the oak roots inspected by a certified arborist to make sure they're stable." "Done," Mark said without hesitation. "And the tree, the memorial tree, the HOA will pay to replace it with a mature, healthy silver maple from any nursery you choose. We'd like to make the planting a community event, if you're okay with that. A way to turn the page." I was taken aback by the sincerity. "I'd like that, Mark. Thank you." Meanwhile, Harold, the former treasurer, was true to his word. He met with the forensic accountant George's brother-in-law had recommended. He turned over years of bank statements, invoices, and expense reports. He was scared, but he was more scared of being an accessory to whatever the audit might uncover. The accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. DeLuca, began her deep dive into the financial soul of the estates at Eagles Landing. A week later, a demolition crew arrived at my house. It was a different crew, a professional one hired by the new board. They worked with surgical precision. Using diamond-bladed saws, they cut the concrete flume into manageable sections. A crane lifted the heavy gray slabs out of the trench, one by one, like a surgeon removing a tumor. The sound of jackhammers and saws was, for once, a welcome noise. It was the sound of progress, of justice being enacted. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk to watch, not with fear or anger, but with a sense of quiet satisfaction. It was a public exorcism. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Her white SUV remained parked in her driveway, and her blinds were drawn. She had become a ghost in the neighborhood she once ruled. The day they removed the last piece of concrete, a cheer went up from the small crowd of onlookers. The ugly scar was gone. The next day, a landscape architect, also hired by the board, came to supervise the restoration. The trench was backfilled with clean topsoil, compacted, and graded precisely according to the original developer's plans, which I provided. The arborist came and examined the roots of my old oak trees, pronouncing them healthy and undamaged. A truck delivered pallets of the most beautiful, deep green sod I had ever seen. The landscapers laid it perfectly, and within hours my yard was whole again. It was better than whole. It looked pristine. The final piece of the restoration was the tree. Sarah, Lily, and I went to the best nursery in the county. We found a magnificent silver maple, already 15 feet tall, with a full, healthy canopy. The next Saturday, the nursery delivered it. Mark, George, Mrs. Gable, and about 50 other neighbors were there. The crew dug a new hole in the exact spot where the original sapling had been. Together, Mark and I guided the tree into the earth. Lily helped shovel the last bit of soil around the root ball. It wasn't just a replacement tree. It was a symbol of the community's own rebirth. Mrs. Gable brought a beautiful, hand-painted stone that read, "In memory and for new beginnings." We placed it at the base of the tree. It was a profoundly healing moment. While the physical scars on my property were healing, the financial investigation was digging up a decade of decay. Ms. DeLuca, the forensic accountant, presented her preliminary findings to the interim board, with Tom and me present as observers. The news was stunning. "The level of financial mismanagement is staggering," she said, pointing to a spreadsheet projected on the wall. "For years, the HOA has been paying a company called Prestige Landscape Solutions exorbitant fees for basic services, mowing, fertilizing, mulching. Their rates are nearly double the market average." She clicked to the next slide. "I did a corporate record search. The sole proprietor of Prestige Landscape Solutions is a man named Derek Peters." A collective gasp went through the room. "Karen's husband?" Mark asked. "No, Miss DeLuca said, a grim smile on her face. Her brother-in-law. But the checks were all mailed to a P.O. box that I traced back to Karen herself. And the bank records for Prestige show that within a day of every deposit from the HOA, a corresponding amount, minus a small percentage, was transferred directly into Karen's personal savings account. It was embezzlement, pure and simple. Over 10 years, she had siphoned nearly $250,000 from the HOA funds using a bogus landscaping company as a front. The community improvement projects she was so proud of, the fancy new sign at the entrance, the clubhouse renovations, they were all done by contractors who kicked back a percentage to her. The drainage ditch was just the latest example. The concrete company she'd hired had submitted an invoice for $30,000, nearly 3 times the actual cost. The excess, presumably, was destined for her pocket. She wasn't just a power-mad tyrant, she was a common thief. The board immediately voted to turn over Ms. DeLuca's entire report to the district attorney's office. This was no longer a civil matter or a county ordinance violation. This was felony grand larceny. My personal fight had uncovered a massive criminal enterprise that had been bleeding the community dry for years. The county's environmental case proceeded as well. The new board, on the advice of their lawyer, signed a consent decree. They admitted fault, agreed to pay a reduced but still substantial fine of $50,000, and committed to funding the environmental monitoring of the wetland for the next 5 years. They also agreed to hire an engineering firm to design a proper, legal, and effective drainage solution for the entire neighborhood, which would be built on actual community property and easements. Karen's downfall was complete. She was facing a civil suit that would likely bankrupt her, a county enforcement action that had stripped her of her power, and now a criminal investigation that could send her to prison. A for sale sign appeared in her front yard a week later. But the market for a house owned by the most hated person in the neighborhood, a house that was a monument to bad drainage karma, was not exactly hot. The wheels of justice, once they finally gain traction, can be merciless. Karen's life unraveled with a speed and totality that was almost biblical. The district attorney's office, armed with Ms. DeLuca's meticulous forensic audit, moved swiftly. They convened a grand jury, and with Harold's terrified testimony and the mountain of financial evidence, an indictment was handed down. Karen Peters was charged with multiple counts of grand larceny, embezzlement, and fraud. The local news, which had initially reported on the neighborhood dispute, now had a much juicier story. They ran a segment with the headline, "Suburban HOA, President Accused of Embezzling $250,000 from Neighbors." They showed pictures of her house, the clubhouse, and even used some of the footage I had taken of the trench, which I provided to the new board to use as they saw fit. Her public humiliation was absolute. The for sale sign on her lawn became a local landmark, a symbol of her spectacular fall from grace. She and her husband became prisoners in their own home. According to neighbors, they were forced to get their groceries delivered, as any trip to the local supermarket was met with cold stares and whispered comments. The power she had so desperately craved and abused had vanished, leaving her with nothing but shame and a looming court date. My civil suit, handled by Tom, was resolved out of court. The HOA's insurance company, faced with the irrefutable evidence of willful misconduct and the separate criminal charges, settled quickly to avoid a public trial. The settlement covered all of my expenses, the cost of Tom's legal fees, the surveyor's fees, the arborist consultation, and a significant sum for the diminution of property value and punitive damages. It was more than enough to compensate for the trouble, but the money was never the point. The point was the principle. The HOA, under Mark's leadership, used the settlement as a catalyst for change. They held a series of town hall meetings, real ones this time, to discuss the new professionally designed drainage plan. The engineers explained how they would use a series of French drains and bioswales on common property to manage the water flow naturally and effectively, actually improving the local ecosystem rather than damaging it. The cost would be covered by the HOA's reserve funds that would now be growing thanks to the termination of the contract with Prestige Landscape Solutions and the hiring of a legitimate, competitively priced landscaping company. The vote to approve the new plan was unanimous. The community, once fractured by fear and resentment, was working together. The most satisfying moment for me came about 6 months after that first fateful day. I was in my backyard watching Lily play on the tire swing we had hung from a sturdy branch of the big oak tree. My lawn was a seamless carpet of green. The new silver maple, Danny's tree, had taken root and was flourishing, its leaves rustling in the breeze. It was the picture of peace I had always dreamed of. Just then, a landscaping truck pulled up to Karen's old house. The for sale sign was gone, replaced by a sold sticker. A new family, a young couple with a toddler, had bought it at a steep discount. The truck from the new legitimate landscaping company began unloading equipment. Their first task was to begin jackhammering the massive concrete patio in the backyard, the source of the original problem. The new owners, informed by the HOA of the entire saga, were committed to restoring the property's natural permeability. The sound of that jackhammer breaking apart Karen's monument to her own selfishness was the sweetest music I had ever heard. It was the sound of the last piece of her toxic legacy being ground into dust. A few months after that, Karen Peters took a plea deal. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, she pleaded guilty to 1 count of grand larceny. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation, ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, and serve 6 months of house arrest. She was also permanently barred from ever serving on any board or in any fiduciary capacity for any organization again. The restitution payments meant she and her husband had to sell their other assets. They lost everything they had gained through her decade of theft. Justice in the end was not just symbolic, it was financial. The estates at Eagles Landing transformed. Mark served as interim president for a year, overseeing the implementation of the new drainage system and the restoration of the HOA's finances. He then stepped down, and a new board was elected in the first truly democratic HOA election in over a decade. The rules were revised. The absurdly restrictive covenants were amended to allow for more personal freedom while still maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetic. The culture of fear was replaced by a culture of cooperation. People started talking to each other again. There were block parties and community cleanup days. It became the neighborhood the glossy brochure had always promised. Sometimes when I look out at my backyard, I think about the sheer arrogance it took for one person to decide they had the right to carve up another's life for their own convenience. And I'm reminded that the world is full of Karens, big and small, who believe their will is law. They thrive in the shadows of apathy and fear. They count on good people to stay silent, to decide it's easier to keep their heads down than to fight. But what my story proves, what I hope everyone takes away from this, is that you can fight back. You don't have to be a lawyer or a prosecutor. You just need to be organized. You need to document everything. You need to read the rules they hide behind and use them against them. You need to find allies because your fight is almost certainly their fight too. And most importantly, you have to be relentless. You have to be willing to see it through to the end. Because the moment you show them you won't back down, their power begins to evaporate. My name is Jack Corrigan. I'm a husband, a father, a veteran, and a homeowner. I came to this neighborhood seeking peace and was met with a war. But by fighting that war, by standing up not just for my own property, but for the rule of law and the good of the community, I found a deeper peace than I ever expected. It's the peace that comes from justice served, from a community restored, and from knowing that a tree planted in memory of a fallen friend now stands taller and stronger than ever, a silent testament to the fact that some lines are not meant to be crossed.